So in this video, I'm going to be buying a cheap but rare PC off Facebook Marketplace. I found the one. We're going to be testing its gaming performance.
Yeah, I would say it's okay. Pretty good.
I'm then going to swap its almost 20-year-old GPU with my current computer's GPU and vice versa to create the ultimate CPU bottleneck machine versus the ultimate GPU bottleneck, and we're going to see which comes out on top. So my criteria for the Facebook Marketplace PC is that it needs to be old, cheap, and it needs to have some interesting components. So let's get looking. So let's search PCs on Facebook Marketplace. We're going to go 30-kilometer radius so I don't have to drive too far. I'm going to look for one less than £50. I think that's reasonable. So the first one that's popped up is just titled PC and it's $50 and only 6 kilometers away. It's got a DVD drive and SD card readers on the front. And this image looks like it's got a dedicated GPU, which is exactly what we're looking for. So it says it's got 8 gigabytes of RAM, a Radeon R9 200 graphics card, 500GB SSD, and some sort of AMD processor. Drop the seller a message. Now let's see what else is available. There's a whole bunch of office PCs that probably don't have graphics cards. So I've come across one called PC Tower that's 24 kilometers away and only costs £30. So in the description it says good home PC, not a gaming PC. Has Windows 10 Pro and 4 gigabytes of RAM. So the front of the tower looks okay. They've wrote down the specs and taped it to the top of the computer. That's very organized. So what specs do we have? An AMD Phenom 8550. It says it's a 3-core CPU with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Unfortunately, we don't have a dedicated graphics card, which is a deal breaker. And the CPU feels too similar to my last Marketplace PC. Ideally, I want an Intel CPU to spice things up a bit. I then spent the next 20 minutes scouring Facebook Marketplace for PCs until eventually I found something that caught my attention. So I've just found this HP PC for £30. So it's titled HP Windows 11 PC Computer Desktop Tower and it's listed for £30 and it's not too far away. So from the photos, the case just looks like any old HP PC from 15 years ago. If you look closer, it's got a Windows Vista sticker. And if you look below that, what looks like a Core 2 quad sticker, which is exactly the sort of CPU I'm looking for. And if we have a look at this photo from the back, it looks like there is a dedicated GPU. Got Windows 11 Pro, 4 gigabytes of RAM, and the sticker wasn't lying. It has a Core 2 Quad Q6600, which was a very high-end CPU from about 2007. I believe it was one of the first commercial quad-core CPUs, which is very exciting. And we've also got a 60 gigabyte SSD, 320 gig hard drive, card reader, and wow, an NVIDIA GeForce 9600 GS, which is a 1 gigabyte graphics card. That is exactly what we're looking for. So I dropped the seller a message, and half an hour later, I get a reply with their address. So I jump in my car and drive approximately half an hour to collect the PC. So after a quick inspection, I was happy to go ahead with the purchase. I ended up paying £30 for this computer. I then drove back home and lugged this dinosaur of a PC inside. So here it is, the 18-year-old Facebook Marketplace HP Pavilion. Let's take a closer look. So let's start off by taking a look at the external design of this fossil. So at the top of the PC, we have a multi-card reader. A lot of these cards are obsolete, like Pro Duo. I think that's Sony's proprietary card from like 2005. There's also a smart media card reader and a compact flash. That seems pretty ancient. Moving down, we have this tray that reveals a DVD drive. And then down again, there's another flap with nothing behind it. And then there's this glory hole labeled HP Pocket Media Drive Bay with nothing inside. And then below the HP logo, there's an interesting button labeled HP Easy Backup. So I asked ChatGPT what that button actually does. And apparently back in the day, it would launch the HP Backup and Recovery Manager to help you back up your PC. Moving down, we have 2 more flaps. The left-hand one reveals a mic port, headphone jack, 2 USB 2 ports, and this mysterious port here. So after using Google Lens, that mystery port is a FireWire port. It's a bit before my time. Now moving over to the right-hand side, there was this mystery insect mummified cocoon. So you know I had to Google Lens it. And it turns out it was a moth that didn't quite make the transformation. Anyway, under the right flap is another flap with nothing inside. Do have a Windows Vista sticker and a Core 2 quad sticker. Interestingly, on top of the tower, there is a rubberized pad, which I've not seen before. It basically turns the top of this PC into a mini coffee table. So you can put your coffee. What's this? Got no idea what that is. If anyone knows, let me know in the comments section below. And finally, on top we have a power button. Moving over to the side of the PC, it looks like someone's been using this vent as a cheese grater. Oh wait, that might have been me. Around the back of the PC we have the power connector, the GeForce 9600, which actually has a HDMI port, which is pretty cool. We then have all the motherboard outputs, so a bunch of mic and sound outputs, Ethernet, 4 USB 2 ports, another FireWire port. There's some digital audio as well as PS2 ports for a mouse and keyboard. So now for the part of the video you've all been waiting for, we're going to take a look inside this computer. But first, if you have been enjoying, please consider subscribing and dropping us a like. It turns out that 99% of our viewers are non-subscribers, so it really helps out the channel if you are enjoying to consider subscribing. Anyway, let's go on with the video. So here's the inside of the PC. At the top we have a power supply, and then over here we have our GeForce 9600. This is definitely a very old looking GPU with a single fan there at the back. And underneath our GPU we have a very basic looking Asus cooler that's coated in dust. But it's what's behind this cooler that interests me, the Core 2 Quad. So let's take this cooler off and have a closer look. So I then went ahead and unscrewed the 4 screws holding in the CPU cooler. This thing was very dirty. I then cleaned off the thermal paste, revealing the legendary Q66 engraving. This Intel CPU is very cool. Released in 2007, it was one of the first consumer quad-core CPUs. It was based on 65nm architecture with a clock speed of 2.4 GHz and 8 MB of L2 cache. And after admiring the CPU for a few minutes, it was time to return it to the motherboard. And this time I'm listening to the comments of my last marketplace video and only using a blob of thermal paste, but I still made a mess. Alright, let's carry on exploring the internals of this PC. So over here we have the 320 gig hard drive, and in front of that we have the 60 gigabyte SATA SSD. And finally, beside the CPU we have 4 sticks of DDR2 RAM. So here we have a 1 gigabyte stick of DDR2 RAM clocked at 666 megahertz. So we've taken a look at the internals of this PC. It's now time to see if it actually boots up, and then we're going to test some games. So I've now plugged in a monitor, mouse and keyboard, and we're going to see if this computer actually boots up. Oh, it's making a noise. Yes, we've actually got a display output. Let's open up Task Manager and see what we're dealing with. So as expected, we have the Q6600 installed. And what's interesting is that it's idling at about 3%, which is very impressive considering how old this computer is. If you can remember our last marketplace PC, which had the AMD A6 inside it, idled at like 99%. Whereas this Core 2 Quad is like 5 years older than that AMD A6, and it's idling at like 3%, which is very impressive. In terms of memory, we have 4 gigabytes of DDR2 memory, clocked at 800 megahertz, and all 4 slots are populated. At idle it's using 55% of the RAM, which is a little bit concerning because we don't have anything open. In terms of storage, we have the 60 gigabyte SSD and then the 320 gig hard drive, as well as a whole bunch of removable USB drives. I'm not sure why those are showing up. One thing that immediately became apparent after using this computer for a few minutes was the speed. This thing felt significantly faster than the £15 Gumtree PC that I reviewed in my previous video, but that's probably due to the fact that this computer has an SSD. So it's now time to test out some games on this Grandad PC. So I decided to start off light with Half-Life 2 running at 1080p high settings. I was getting around 30 frames per second. I then decided to drop the settings down to low, and wow, I'm getting over 100 FPS. Next, I decided to jump into Left 4 Dead 2, running at 1080p very high settings. I was also getting around 30 frames per second, but this felt worse than Half-Life 2, it was more choppy, so I ended up dropping the settings down to medium. And with medium settings, I was getting around 50 frames per second. This was very playable. Next was my favourite game of 2010. The original Black Ops Zombies. This game doesn't have a whole lot in the way of video settings, but I did have textures on low, and at 1080p it ran surprisingly well. I was getting a fairly stable 45 FPS, but I probably should have put the textures on medium. Low textures look awful. I then tried Dark Souls Remastered, but that requires DX11 support. I then jumped into Crysis and was greeted with an Nvidia and a Core 2 Duo logo. This was giving me hope that this game could run. Unfortunately, at 720p on gamer settings, which is the equivalent to high, it ran at like 18 FPS, which is unplayable. I understand why they called this the PC killer.
I then lowered the settings to 720p low and it was a playable experience. I was getting around 40 FPS and it was pretty stable, but it was definitely not as visually stunning as before. Next I jumped into Minecraft Bedrock Edition. I couldn't seem to get the FPS counter to work in this game, but I was getting around 35-40 FPS. The gameplay felt smooth enough, but there was one problem. There was loads of input lag.
Bruh. So it is in fact the next day, and in this part of the video we're going to attempt something very interesting. I'm going to try and transplant this ancient GPU, this GeForce 9600 GS from this 20-year-old Facebook Marketplace computer into my current modern gaming PC. I reckon it's going to trigger some people if I say this is modern. It's got a 3060 Ti, so it's definitely no 9800 X3D 5090 combo, but it's definitely a lot more modern than this computer. So it'll be interesting to see if we can create the ultimate CPU bottleneck and the ultimate GPU bottleneck. Let's go on with it.
So I started off by trying to pull the 9600 GS out of the case. There were so many cables in the way, but after about 2 or 3 minutes of trying, I eventually got the card out. There it is. Now I just need to transplant it into my current PC's motherboard.
So I've put the GeForce 9600 GS into this modern gaming PC. It's now time to see if it actually boots up. I've connected it to the monitor. Oh, we've got something on the screen. Down here it says the VGA card is not supported by UEFI driver. And what does it want us to do? Press F2 to continue. I think that's a good idea. We'll do that. Yes, we've actually done it. Look at that. There's a display. I guess we now need to check out some heavily GPU bottlenecked games.
So let's jump back into Half-Life 2. High settings, 1080p. And it basically gets the same frame rate as before. We were probably GPU limited before, so I then dropped the graphics settings to low and we were back up at 100 frames per second. I then wanted to test out the outside area to make it a fair comparison. For some reason with the modern CPU it's getting a worse frame rate than with the Core 2 Quad. I don't know what's going on. If anyone's got any ideas, let me know in the comment section below. I then jumped back into Black Ops Zombies and I seem to be getting a slightly higher frame rate than before, but I think that's probably because it's a different map and I forgot to set the resolution to 1080p, so I don't know what I'm running at. At 1080p very high settings, Left 4 Dead 2 was unfortunately unplayable. I barely hit 20 frames per second, so I then dropped the settings down to low and this really helped. I was consistently getting over 100 frames per second, which is pretty impressive for a GPU that's slower than Intel HD 4000. Let that sink in. Finally, we tested the king of PC gaming, Crysis. And just like before on high settings, it was pretty unplayable. I was getting around 17 FPS. But after dropping the settings to low 720p, it was pretty playable around 35-40 FPS. So my conclusion is this 9600 GS isn't any quicker for gaming when paired with a modern CPU. Now it's time to try and cram the 3060 Ti into this tiny cable-infested PC, and after a very painful few minutes I somehow managed to fit the card in. I then ran into another problem. The power supply didn't have any spare connectors to power the GPU, but I had an idea. I was going to use the power supply from my personal rig by putting it next to it and stretching the cable across. This probably isn't a good idea, but it's all I could think of.
Now for the moment of truth, is my Frankenstein PC setup actually going to work? So we're using the power supply on my desktop to power just the GPU, and then the rest of the 20-year-old computer is powered from its original power supply, but the GPU's hooked up to the monitor, so we're going to see if this actually works. I assume I have to power both of them on at the same time, so let's see if that actually works. So the issue seems to be the boot device rather than the GPU that's powered from the wrong power supply. Which is very interesting, so that means that this is actually working. So I'm going to try and fix the boot device because I think I must have unplugged something. With much difficulty I managed to connect the SATA cable. I had to hook that little red cable down there into that SSD there. I'm actually very impressed how I managed to fit that 3060 in this case. There's literally no room and there's so many cables. But anyway, we've got a display output. So this abomination Frankenstein, two PCs working together, is producing an image, which is good. We're going to try and play some games on our ultimate CPU bottleneck machine. With this configuration, we may have an advantage because there are going to be Windows 11 drivers for the 3060, whereas when we were testing the GeForce 9600, there weren't any Windows 11 drivers.
So with that said, I went and installed the latest NVIDIA drivers, and then jumped back into Half-Life to see how it performed. And straight away at 1080p high settings I was getting much higher frame rates. In the outside area I was consistently getting over 120 FPS. And it was a similar story for Left 4 Dead 2. At 1080p very high settings I was consistently getting around 60 to 70 FPS and it felt very playable. It was all going so well until the system decided to blue screen and corrupt Windows.
So unfortunately I only managed to test 2 games until this PC decided to crash. But what this has shown is the Core 2 Quad along with the 3060 Ti is more powerful than the Ryzen 5 5500 paired with the GeForce 9600 GS. That's information that you probably didn't need to know, but hopefully you have enjoyed. And if you did enjoy, leave a comment down below. Drop us a like and consider subscribing because I'm going to be doing some more Facebook Marketplace PC finds, actually just over here. I've just picked up this Windows XP laptop for £20 on Facebook Marketplace and I'm going to be showcasing that in an up and coming video, so don't miss out. Anyway, I'll see everyone in my next video.